Conventional wisdom states that you never ask a woman her age, you never ask a man how much he earns, and you never ask a German company what they got up to between the years of 1933 and 1945. And while we couldn't possibly begin to comment on the first two, we can definitely say that that last little nugget of wisdom absolutely holds true, as there's loads of German companies still in business today for which that question is an awkward one indeed. And today we'll be looking at 5 of them. Let's begin. When it comes to companies with strong Nazi credentials, you'd struggle to find a better example than Volkswagen, because they weren't just a long-lived company that threw its lot in with them for the pursuit of profit, nor even just a company that was founded during the regime's existence and had no hesitation cashing in. Instead, they were proactively founded by the Nazi state itself. More specifically, they were founded in 1937 by Strength Through Joy, or KDF, an arm of the Nazi state that was all about raising the living standards of the German worker through the provision of various subsidized leisure activities. The Volkswagen, literally people's car, emerged as an attempt by the KDF to deliver a cheap and cheerful car to the masses. The car itself would be designed by none other than Ferdinand Porsche, a name which may sound familiar and will indeed be coming back up in later chapters. And speaking of things that may seem familiar, here is the Volkswagen itself, or to give you its proper name, the Volkswagen Type 1. It's the exact same Volkswagen Beetle of hippie and lovebug fame, and it stayed in production from 1938 right the way through to 2003, with only the most minimal of changes being made to the original Nazi-penned fundamental design. To see the Type 1 reach mass production, an enormous factory was built in Wolfsburg, with the foundation stone being laid by none other than Adolf Hitler himself on the 26th of May, 1938. So enormous was this factory that it was initially named Stadt der KDF Wagen, or City of the KDF Car. Instead of creating cheap and cheerful cars for the German workers, however, the factory was soon enough turned over for military production as World War II loomed ever closer, with not a single Type 1 ever being delivered to a civilian, despite many of them having contributed handsomely to the KDF's saving scheme that was meant to see them receive one. They also saw the Wolfsburg plant widen its production range too. The Type 1 continued being produced, with all of them finding their way either to the military or party as staff cars, but it was also joined by things such as the Type 82 Kubelwagen, essentially just a Type 1 chassis with a more utilitarian body plonked on top. The Type 166 Schwimmwagen, basically just an aquatic Type 82, and also the Type 87, a Type 1 with 4-wheel drive and a slightly raised suspension to make it more useful in the sticky stuff. The story gets much worse, however, because it wasn't just the Volkswagen churned out vehicles that the Nazi war machine used in the execution of its wicked deeds, but they were also proactively involved in them, as they used a lot of slave labour. It didn't start that way, however. They started off using highly skilled and rather well compensated male labour, and then as that workforce started to thin out due to mass conscriptions for military service, they then turned to hiring German women at equally favourable rates to plug the gaps. Come the middle of the war, however, when there was simply no more Germans left to shove into the factory, and with the production demands of the Wehrmacht only ever growing, they began turning to slave labourers, which the Nazi Party was only too happy to provide from its vast network of concentration camps. Soon enough, their use of them became so prolific that the Volkswagen factory had 4 concentration camps in it, not supplying it, inside of the camp. All of these satellite camps of the Neuengamme concentration camp. All in all, come 1944, when the Volkswagen's relationship with the camp network had fully bloomed, 60% of its workforce were slave labourers, and needless to say, they suffered from absolutely appalling treatment, being poorly housed, malnourished, and subject to wanton brutality from their overseers at any given time. But that kind of thing is, tragically, common to the story of Nazism. Something that's unique to Volkswagen, however, is the way in which they treated pregnant slave labourers and their children. You see, they established a facility on the factory site which was ostensibly to care for their newborns so that their mothers could better focus on their work. In reality, no such attempts were made, and hundreds of infants ended up dying from malnutrition and medical neglect while in the factory's so-called care. So bad was it, in fact, that post-war, the physician responsible for overseeing the facility, one Dr. Hans Kurbel, was executed for crimes against humanity, the only member of the Volkswagen management team to receive such a sentence. After the war, the Wolfsburg was reopened and cleaned up by the British Army, both to give work to the local population, many of whom had worked there during the war, and to help relieve them of their own vehicle shortages in occupied Germany. After a few years, it was handed over to the state of Lower Saxony, and Volkswagen, in the form in which we both know it today was born. For its part, however, Volkswagen makes no attempt to hide its origins, nor make excuses for what it did during the Nazi period. It has also made some efforts to right the wrongs it's committed during its nascent years, and in 1999 it joined other wartime companies in establishing the Remembrance, Responsibility and Future Foundation, which aimed to provide reparations to former slave labourers. Volkswagen, however, isn't the only German car manufacturer to possess a pair of blood-stained hands, as Mercedes-Benz, the modern manufacturer of both high-end luxury cars and low-end mass-market cars with gloss plastic smothered interiors that fool you into thinking they're high-end, also got up to some simply appalling stuff during the Nazi period. Mercedes itself is an old company, far older than Nazism itself, and is able to trace its roots back to the first ever car, the Benz patent Motorwagen, from all the way back in 1885. This naturally meant that, come the ascension of Nazism in 1933, it was already quite the large industrial concern, having had time to branch out into aircraft engines, with its engines being the same ones that powered the Albatros D3 and Fokker D7 in World War I. Trucks such as the Low 2000 from 1932 and luxury cars such as the S series from 1926. And when Nazi rearmament efforts began, Mercedes was only too happy to rise up to the occasion, expanding its manufacturing facilities, applying its expertise, and cashing in all those juicy government checks that came their way. This led to them producing aircraft engines such as the DB600 series. This engine alone, in its many variants, would go on to be produced by the tens of thousands, with its DB601 model, which found its way into the Messerschmitt 109 fighter and the Messerschmitt 110 fighter bomber, having approximately 19,000 units produced, and the later DB605, which powered later variants of those same aircraft, having approximately 42,000 units produced. They went similarly all out with their trucks. For example, their most produced truck of the Nazi period, the L3000, had over 33,000 units produced after its introduction in 1938. And while that was by far the most produced, they weren't exactly holding back with their other models, with the L1500 and the L3000 little brother having 9,000 units produced come the war's end. Mercedes was also more than happy to supply its passenger cars to the Nazi military, with the particularly notable example being the W136. They supplied it in two different variants, the 170V, which the military called it, which was just a normal model given a quick spraying of dunkelgelb paint, and the 170VK, which was a W136 chassis with a more utilitarian and easier to mass produce body plonked on top of it. The exact number of cars that Mercedes provided to the military remains unknown, but we do have a few surviving figures that give us an idea. For example, we know that 75,000 W136s were produced in total between 1936 and 1942, which includes at least 19,170 VKs specifically, all of which went to the military, and that a very sizable portion of the remaining 56,000 or so were purchased by the military too. Mercedes luxury cars also continued to do a roaring trade during the Nazi period too, as they were a go-to choice for all of the big league armband enthusiasts and the industrialists who became fabulously wealthy, bending the knee to them. For example, here's Hitler in a Mercedes 770K W31 and a 540K, and here's Goering, Himmler, Röhm, and Goebbels, who, as you can see, loved themselves a nice Merc. All of this naturally meant that Mercedes did rather well for themselves in the Nazi period, as evidenced by the fact that their workforce swelled from a mere 9,000 in 1932 up to a whopping 65,000 in 1943. And you know full well where this is going next. Yeah, that's right, slave labour. Just as we got with Volkswagen, Mercedes found itself completely unable to keep up with their wartime material demands, and so happily turned to concentration camp slave labour to keep its factories churning out trucks, engines and flash motors at their maximum rate. As a further bonus for them too, which was less applicable to Volkswagen since it was a state enterprise, it also turned out that the fee that had to be paid to the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office for access to their slaves was significantly less than the going rate for German labour, and so they even got to increase their profit margins out of it too. All things said, Mercedes did very well out of the war. Many of its production facilities remained undamaged, and even better for them still, their construction had been subsidised by a government that no longer existed, so the future dividends were all theirs for the taking. Not only did Mercedes survive the war in a very nice position economically, but denazification also made very little difference to the roster of its management, as exemplified best by the fact that their wartime CEO, one Wilhelm Haspel, who had originally assumed the role in 1945, 1942, stayed there until his death in 1952. To be fair to Mercedes, however, they were also one of the first German companies to willingly conduct a full internal investigation into its wartime activities with a view to paying reparations, which it began doing in 1986. 2 years later, it was announced that its findings were in, and Mercedes intended to pay 20 million Deutschmarks to its victims, about 29 million US dollars converted and adjusted for inflation. Much like Volkswagen today, Mercedes also makes no attempts to hide its dark past and discusses it freely and openly in their press materials. Unlike Volkswagen and Mercedes, Bayer is a company whose name might not be immediately familiar to you, but we'd bet a kidney on the fact you've almost certainly used their products in your life, as they are one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on Earth. The company began all the way back in 1863 as a simple dye manufacturer, and soon found itself branching out into all other sorts of chemical products. It wouldn't hit big until 1899, however, when it launched aspirin, a product we're sure needs no introduction. From there, in 1925, with aspirin making absolute bank for Bayer, it eventually found itself being folded into IG Farben, which was a brand new conglomerate mega company made up of 6 major German chemical companies. With the coming of the Nazis 8 years later, IG Farben, and by extension Bayer, wasted no time at all scooping up all the cash they could from this very spend-happy new regime. Like Mercedes, they were also only too happy to make full use of the concentration camps to boost both their output and their profit margins, even going so far as to build factories inside concentration camps themselves, specifically at Auschwitz and Monowitz. Come 1943, so prolific had their use of slave labour become that slaves made up half of their 330,000 strong workforce. It gets worse, however, because Bayer, not IG Farben, but Bayer specifically as a subdivision therein, also saw the concentration camps as a cracking opportunity to do some medical research, specifically the kind that would be absolutely verboten back when enlightened men held the reins of Germany. They paid the SS a little over a single Reichsmark for their subjects, and, well, if you want to know how they were treated, just listen to this quote originally penned by a Bayer employee to Rudolf Hoss, the commandant of Auschwitz, quote, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We would kindly request that you send us another group of women to the same number and at the same price." It's also worth stating outright, as this does wrongly get repeated about quite a bit, that Bayer did not make Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide that the SS used to mass murder their hated minorities en masse. Well, not directly anyway. Instead, it was produced by a company called De Gesch, which IG Farben partially owned. So no, Bayer didn't make Zyklon B, although it was very, very closely connected to the people who did. After the war, Bayer's leadership came under intense scrutiny at the Nuremberg trials, with several of its most senior staff facing prosecution. For example, Fritz Temir, who played a role in planning and overseeing the construction of the Bayer facility at Auschwitz, was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the use of slave labour and for his role in the deaths of thousands of slave labourers and experimentation victims. He was released in early 1950 and later returned to a prominent position at Bayer, where he was shortly after selected as chairman of the board of directors in 1951. Others didn't get off so lightly, however, as Helmut Vetter, who had been involved in administering those horrible medieval experiments we discussed, he was sentenced to death for his crimes against humanity and sent to the rope in 1949. Bayer itself became an independent company once again in 1952 when IG Farben was broken up, existing today only as a shell company responsible for paying long still owed reparation debts. Bayer themselves, just like Volkswagen and Mercedes before them, today freely admit to their dark history and do not attempt to brush anything under the rug. In 1995, Helge Wehmeyer, Bayer's then CEO, offered a public apology for his company's Nazi period actions, and several years later, Bayer too joined the Remembrance, Responsibility and Future Foundation, just like Volkswagen. Back to cars once again for our penultimate entry, because as we alluded to back in our Volkswagen chapter, both Ferdinand Porsche, the man, and the company he founded bearing his name was very involved with the Nazi regime. It went far beyond simply designing the Volkswagen Type 1, however, as he also designed the Types 82, 87 and 166 that we saw earlier as well. But ultimately, Porsche, the man, was essentially an employee of Volkswagen when he worked on them, so Porsche, the company, cannot be ascribed any of the credit or blame, as the case may be, for having designed them. For the stuff that was designed and built by Porsche's own company, we have to look at stuff that's just a tad bit bigger, because it was tanks that he was really interested in. His first serious crack at designing a tank came in 1939, when he created a prototype medium tank, which was dubbed the VK 30.01. It didn't go anywhere, however. Partly, this was because Porsche had attempted to circumvent the usual procurement process, having heard a rumour that Mercedes was also doing the same, and in doing so offended the money men, but also because what he designed was just a bit shit. So ultimately, the program was canned, and the only 2 prototype hulls had been made. It was good practice, however, and gave him a handy head start in May 1941 when he was asked to submit a new design for a brand new 45-ton heavy tank that was to become the Tiger 1. And so he got to work on taking the VK 30.01, biggering it and making it not shit. And this was what he came up with, the VK 45.01P. It was a real showcase of what tank technology of the day could be when pushed to its absolute limit, because not only was it huge and heavily armed, but it was also actually a hybrid, much like a modern Toyota Prius, as its power came from 2 electric motors that were kept full of juice by a whopping great V10 petrol engine, rather than by having said engine power the drive sprocket directly. It wasn't selected to become the Tiger 1, however, chiefly because of its electric drive system. While it was innovative and provided exceptional climbing abilities thanks to the high torque output of the motors, it was expensive to make, an absolute bugger to maintain, and had a nasty habit of catching fire. Unfortunately for Porsche, he had got a bit carried away with himself, and assuming that the contract was in the bag, had gone on to manufacture 10 completed tanks and 90 hulls that were ready to go, save for the turret. Fortunately, Porsche, through his highly successful work on things like the Type 1, had earned himself plenty of brownie points with the bad moustache man, and so after some eyebrow fluttering, he received permission to put 100 examples he had already made to use by turning them into this, the Panzerjäger Tiger P. Essentially just the original VK 45.01 chassis with a big armoured box plonked on top and a giant 88mm Pak 43 cannon shoved into said box. It too was a bit crap, however, as it turns out that taking an already unreliable hull and adding even more weight to the top of it doesn't exactly remedy said unreliability. But from Porsche's position, it was happy days. He'd got some cash back and stopped the failed VK 45.01 project from absolutely financially obliterating his company. Porsche would also have a go at developing something even bigger, specifically the 188-ton Panzer 8th Maus. That too was a failure that never reached production, but at least it was the state footing the bill from the offset that time. So, where does the story get evil then, besides, the whole making tanks for history's most genocidal regime business? And once again, it comes down to slave labour. As while Porsche was doing what it did with tanks throughout the war, it wasn't exactly willing and compensated workers helping them do it, as they had 400 concentration camp inmates on the books. Not to worry, however, because Newsroom, Porsche's official media portal, reassures us that they were much nicer to their slaves than Volkswagen was, so we guess that's fine then. Despite the rather tone-deaf nature of some of their own press materials, however, Porsche has actually put their hands in their pockets and issued reparations over the years, with us able to track down 2 particular instances, both in 1999. The first saw them donate 5 million Deutschmarks to the Foundation of Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, and the second saw them make one-off payments of 10,000 Deutschmarks to individuals they had previously kept as slave labourers. For our last entry, we have Hugo Boss, the famous purveyor of smelly stuff and fancy underpants. Founded in 1924 as a factory producing workwear, the company soon enough became very willingly complicit in supporting and profiting off of Nazism, with its founder, the titular Hugo Ferdinand Boss, being so into the old National Socialism that he was actually a pre-1933 member of the party, the real hallmark of a true believer. From as early as 1928, at least by current evidence, the company was taking on contracts for the party, with one of its earliest being to produce the famous brown shirt, as infamously won by both the SA and the Hitler Youth. As he did this well and was a party loyalist, naturally more and more party work came his way as the years rolled on. And you can probably guess what comes next in the story. That's right, slave labour boost production. For Hugo Boss, the company, this began in 1940 when the ever-increasing size of the Nazi military was sending big orders their way and they simply couldn't keep up using voluntary labour. This saw them purchase 140 Polish and 40 French slave labourers from the SS who had to endure horrific conditions as they toiled at the behest of the company's whims. Apologists will say that it's all good in the hood, however, because apparently Hugo Boss was so nice to its slaves that it actually fed them well and everything. Such comments are revisionist twaddle, however, and in reality, overworking, beatings, and the looming threat of being sent back to a concentration camp if they quibbled was the reality of their servitude. A common myth also holds that Hugo Boss designed the Nazi uniform, the M1932, you know, the black one that the SS were all about pre-war. In reality, however, they simply produced them along with everything else, with it actually being designed by Karl Diebitsch and Walter Heck, a pair of artists and graphic designers in the employ of the SS. Hugo Boss, the company, survived after the war, with its leadership eventually being taken over by the family of Hugo Boss, the man following his death in 1948, and they grew it into the giant we know it as today. The company's history remained brushed under the carpet until the 1990s, as it so often did, until pressure ramped up on them to investigate, bear all, and do something about it. This saw the company issue a formal apology in 2011 for its use of slave labour and role in propping up the Nazi regime. They also, at some point, contributed to a reparations fund for the victims of Nazi slave labour, although concrete details of their contribution are hard to come by.